In the previous two videos, we looked in detail at the different sources of finance available to a business, both internal and external. If you remember, internal sources of finance come from within the business, and external come from sources outside of the business. We'll now try and pull everything together by going through the different considerations that an entrepreneur will need to take into account when deciding on the best source of finance for their particular circumstances. Before deciding on the best source of finance, it's important for the business owner to understand its current cash position and the expected cash inflows and outflows in the future. The best way to do this is to prepare what we call a cash flow forecast, showing all the expected payments and sales revenue to get a picture of the overall cash situation in their business. The cash flow forecast will also help the business to understand when it needs additional cash and how much additional cash is required. In some situations, the business may have enough cash or working capital to fund the cash that they need internally, particularly if the amount of cash required is a relatively small amount and is only needed in the short term. To all the teachers out there, show all of these videos without any ads and gain access to our growing library of over 500 teaching worksheets. Why not visit BizzWizard.co.uk to find out more? However, if the cash required can't be funded internally, then the business may need to look at external sources of finance. The type of external financing used will depend on the time frame the cash is required for. If short-term external financing is needed, then an overdraft might be the easiest and best option. However, as we saw in the previous video, an overdraft probably isn't the best long-term solution for funding a major project such as an office move. Businesses that require long-term financing may be able to fund their projects using what we call retained profits, or by selling fixed assets that are no longer needed. However, this isn't available to all businesses, particularly new businesses, so they will need to look at other long-term options. When thinking about the type of long-term finance available for a certain business, this will also depend on the type of business and their ownership structure. For example, a sole trader or partnership can't issue shares, so their only option might be taking on extra debt, like a loan. However, limited companies, private limited companies and public limited companies do have the option to issue shares, so we'll be able to make the choice between debt, like loans, or equity, like issuing more shares in the company. Now, when making the decision on the best source of finance, the cost of each type will need to be taken into account. When a business is evaluating whether to go with debt, like loans, or equity, like issuing shares, the costs involved will play an important factor, and they may even depend on the state of the economy. When interest rates are low, debt becomes a relatively cheap option, and the business may decide to take out a loan instead of issuing shares. This is because the interest payments are really low. However, when interest rates are high, debt becomes less of an attractive option, and the business might decide instead to issue shares or to take on new partners as a result of this. It will also be necessary to reconsider the riskiness of the business when choosing the best source of finance. So they will need to consider the amount of debt that the business already has. If there is a high percentage of debt compared to the equity in the business, they have what we call a high gearing ratio. A high gearing ratio isn't always looked on favourably by stakeholders, such as suppliers or customers. If they already have a high proportion of debt, then the better option might be equity, so selling shares if they have a limited company, or perhaps taking on a new partner if they are a sole trader or a partnership business. It's also important to remember that dividend payments, the payments shareholders get each year, are optional. The company can decide not to make dividend payments. Bring this video and over 100 more to life with fun, interactive games, quizzes and case studies. Why not try the first 25 completely free by visiting BizzWizard.co.uk. However, paying the interest on a loan definitely isn't optional. So if a business has unpredictable sales and profits, or something like a global pandemic happens, it could find itself in a position where it can't make the interest payments on the loan. If the business instead issues equity shares, it can decide whether or not to pay a dividend to its shareholders based on its financial situation, or it can decide not to. Finally, it's important to remember that when a business issues shares, the founder or key shareholders may end up losing control. A shareholder with more than 50% of the equity in the business will have voting control over that business. So this is something that needs to be given careful consideration before issuing shares in order to raise the necessary finance. So before we go any further in this video, we're going to meet Ruby, who is about to start up her own sandwich shop in Lincoln called Grubbed Up. Ruby has a range of options open to her when choosing her sources of finance, but she needs to raise enough finance for everything that she needs. She will have to buy all of the equipment for her shop, she'll have to pay rent on the premises, and have enough cash to manage the day-to-day expenses of running Grubbed Up. Ruby doesn't really know where to start, so she speaks to her friend Ollie, who is an accountant, to get some advice. Ollie tells her that the best place to start is by doing a cash flow forecast to understand all of the expected incomings and outgoings for the shop. This shows Ruby that she's going to need about £20,000 to get her business off the ground. Ollie the accountant tells Ruby that she should, first of all, think about whether she has any internal sources of finance available to her. The three main sources of internal financing are owner's funds, where the business owner, in this case Ruby, have put their own money into the business; retained profits, where profits have been saved from previous years and are then used; the sale of assets, where the business raises money by selling something it owns, such as a building or machinery. As Ruby's business is only just starting up, she doesn't have any retained profits or assets that she can sell. However, Ruby does have some savings and is prepared to put £12,000 of her own money into the business. Ruby has identified £12,000 of internal finance for Grubbed Up, so she needs to find another £8,000 worth of external funding. Having thought it through, Ruby wonders whether an overdraft might be the easiest way of getting some external funding for Grubbed Up. However, from the cash flow forecast that she puts together with Ollie's help, she knows that she's not going to be in a position to pay back the overdraft quickly. Overdrafts can be good as a short-term way of borrowing, but the interest rates tend to be pretty high, making them expensive in the long term. They are also repayable on demand, which could be pretty risky. So Ruby decides instead to look at a long-term source of external finance. Each of the video courses over at BizzWizard.co.uk also includes an interactive business case study that applies the knowledge learnt to a real-world scenario. There are over 1,000 multiple-choice questions, each with detailed feedback, which tests students' understanding of the content. Why not visit BizzWizard.co.uk to find out more? If Ruby had set up the business as a sole trader or a partnership, then she wouldn't have the option of equity as a source of financing. However, Grubbed Up is a limited company, so Ruby could decide to raise finance by issuing equity shares in the business. She decides to compare the pros and cons of raising finance through equity against raising finance through debt by taking out a long-term loan. First of all, she looks at the cost. Interest rates are currently very low, so taking out a loan is currently a cheap way of financing a business long-term. However, she's aware that if she issued equity shares, she would have the option not to pay a dividend to her shareholders if finances didn't allow for this. Ollie also warned her that if she decides to issue equity shares to raise the long-term finance, then any majority shareholder who owns more than 50% of the business would now have control over how the business is run. Ruby wants to keep full control of her business, so she decides to talk to her bank about a loan for the additional £8,000 that she needs. To get this large loan, she's had to fill out a lot of forms, and she's glad that she spent time preparing a cash flow forecast with Ollie, as the bank have also asked to see her projected cash flow. Fortunately, they approve her loan application, meaning that with a combination of the £12,000 internal funding from Ruby, this is the owner's funds, and the £8,000 bank loan, which is external funding, Grubbed Up now has the £20,000 finance that was needed to buy the necessary equipment, to pay for rent on the shop premises, and to manage the day-to-day expenses. In this situation, a combination of internal and external funding was the right solution for Ruby's business. Only time will tell if Ruby's decision to use a mix of both internal and external sources of finance was the best option. Hopefully, this cash injection is enough to get the sandwich shop off the ground and to begin to build a successful business. Always remember, there's no such thing as the best source of finance for all situations. It all depends on the circumstances. If you get a question in the exam asking you to choose the best source of finance for a particular scenario, it's important to use all of the information to weigh up the pros and the cons of each type of finance and to make suggestions based on these advantages and disadvantages. Whatever recommendations you do make, it's important to back them up with solid reasons supporting your judgment. It's a good idea to make sure your evaluation takes into account the amount of finance needed, the time frame that it's needed for, the type of business and the ownership structure, the costs involved, and finally, the level of risk associated with each type. Sometimes it might even be best to recommend a combination of different types of finance, just as our example Ruby chose to when she was setting up her sandwich shop. Remember, picking the best source of finance is really important for every entrepreneur, and if you find yourself in this situation, think back to what we have discussed today before making any big decisions. This has been the BizzWizard. See you in the next video.